Everywhere I go, there's construction happening, whether it's at my home or my girlfriend's place. So if you hear beeps in the background, I am sorry. Okay, goodbye. Hello everyone, this is not goodbye. Please don't stop watching the video right now. Welcome back. This is Pandemics Part 2, where we'll discuss yellow fever, typhus, cholera, influenza, and tuberculosis. Last time we did SARS, the coronavirus, Ebola, and leprosy, so check that out if you missed it and you're interested. Also, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. Alright, let's begin. So, first we're going to do yellow fever. The World Health Organization estimates that as many as 170,000 people had yellow fever in 2013, and of those, 60,000 people died. The death toll is at least in the hundreds of thousands. Like, that's a conservative estimate. It's likely in the millions, perhaps even tens of millions. The origin of the yellow fever virus is found in tropical and subtropical areas of Africa and South America. The virus is spread to people by the bite of an infected mosquito, something that you'll see in a lot of these diseases that kill millions of people. So the virus did originate from Africa, and cases at least stretch back to the 16th century in the US, specifically in Pennsylvania. Now we're going to get to the symptoms. The majority of people infected with the yellow fever virus will either not have symptoms or have mild symptoms and completely recover. But for people who develop symptoms, the time from infection until illness is typically about 3 to 6 days. Like I said, most people won't have any symptoms, but some people who do get the symptoms will have a sudden onset of fever, chills, severe headache, back pain, body aches, nausea, vomiting, fatigue, weakness, and usually the people who get these symptoms will improve within 1 week. But for some people who recover, they could feel weak and in general feel fatigued for up to several months. Now, a few people will develop a more severe form of yellow fever, and for about 1 of the 7 people who have these initial symptoms, there will be a brief remission, like a time where you're feeling better, that may last only a few hours or up to a day, and then it'll be unfortunately followed by a more severe form of the disease. The severe symptoms include high fever, yellow skin, jaundice, bleeding, shock, and organ failure. So severe yellow fever disease can be deadly. Obviously, if you have those symptoms, get help immediately. And among those who develop the severe disease, 30 to 60% die. Now, to take into account, this is happening in Africa and South America, so I don't think the percentage of death might be as high if, say, you're in Canada, Europe, what have you. Anyway, let's move on to spread. Yellow fever is spread by mosquito, and mosquitoes acquire the virus by feeding on infected primates, that is humans or monkeys, gorillas, what have you, and then they transmit the virus to other primates, thus continuing the cycle. People infected with the yellow fever virus are infectious to mosquitoes. This is referred to as being viremic, shortly before the onset of the fever and up to 5 days after the onset. So this disease, yellow fever, it doesn't seem to spread from person to person. It seems to spread from person to mosquito to person. Okay, now we're going to move on to the treatment. So there is no medicine to treat or cure infection from yellow fever, but the best medicine is basically to rest, drink fluids, and use pain relievers and other medication to reduce the fever and relieve the aching. Definitely stay away from mosquitoes so that you don't further spread the disease. And there is a vaccination that protects people from yellow fever anywhere from 30 years to the rest of their life. I believe I got this vaccination myself before I went to move to Singapore. I don't live there anymore, though. So, the modern outlook, yellow fever kills about 30,000 people a year. The most recent statistics from the World Health Organization shows immunization coverage of approximately 41% in 2013 in countries considered at risk for outbreaks. This is a vast increase from 1988, where the disease was at its modern peak with more than 5 million cases reported globally and immunization coverage of less than 5%. The WHO cautions, however, that prevention of outbreaks in affected regions requires 60 to 80% coverage of an at-risk population. That means 60 to 80% of people need to be vaccinated against yellow fever in order to stop the spread. So typhus has killed over 5 million people. Most of these deaths are from a long time ago, but we'll get into that in a little bit. Typhus fevers are a group of diseases caused by bacteria that are spread to humans by fleas, lice, and chiggers. Chiggers are like a small bug. Typhus fevers include scrub typhus, murine typhus, and epidemic typhus. Epidemic typhus is disease spread by body lice, and it was responsible for millions of deaths in previous centuries, but is now considered rare. Scrub typhus is a bacterial disease spread by chiggers in Southeast Asia, and then murine typhus is from fleas, and that is the bacterial disease. It's found in tropical climates around the world, and even reported in various parts of the United States. So, emerging during the Crusades, it had in fact had its first impact in Europe in 1489 in Spain. During fighting between the Christian Spaniards and the Muslims in Granada, the Spanish lost 3,000 to war casualties and 20,000 to typhus. In 1528, the French lost 18,000 troops in Italy and lost supremacy in Italy to the Spanish. In 1542, 30,000 soldiers died of typhus while fighting the Ottomans in the Balkans. During the 30 Years' War, which was 1618 to 1648, about 8 million Germans were killed by bubonic plague and typhus. Obviously, I don't know exactly what percentage was killed by bubonic plague and what was killed by typhus. I presume that bubonic plague killed more, but I'll get into bubonic plague in part 3. Okay, so the disease also played a major role in the destruction of Napoleon's Grande Armée, his big army, I'm not French, in Russia in 1812. During the retreat from Moscow, more French military personnel died of typhus than were killed by the Russians. Of the 450,000 soldiers who crossed the Neman on the 25th of June 1812, fewer than 40,000 returned. So that's less than 10%. Now again, are all these deaths from typhus? I don't know exactly. Probably a lot of them. Maybe even most of them. More military personnel were killed from 1500 to 1914 by typhus than from military action. In early 1813, Napoleon raised a new army of 500,000 to replace his Russian losses. In the campaign of that year, over 219,000 of Napoleon's soldiers died of typhus. Typhus played a major factor in the Irish potato famine. During World War I, typhus epidemics killed over 150,000 in Serbia alone. There were about 25 million infections and 3 million deaths from epidemic typhus in Russia from 1918 to 1922. Typhus also killed numerous prisoners in Nazi concentration camps and Soviet prisoner of war camps during World War II, and more than 3.5 million Soviet POWs died out of the 5.7 million in Nazi custody. So you can kind of see where I got my 5 million dead from typhus number. It seems like this mostly happens to soldiers and I guess people who are being held prisoner. I guess I chose 5 million because it seemed like a conservative estimate. I mean, the number could be much more depending on who really died from typhus, who died from other diseases, and so on. Okay, now we're going to get into the symptoms. The most common symptoms of typhus are fever, headaches, and sometimes a rash. They are spread by, chiggers spread scrub typhus, fleas spread murine typhus, and body lice spread epidemic typhus. You can see how, unsanitary conditions in the wars of the past 500 years could lead to typhus spreading. So the treatment for typhus, you can prevent it by reducing exposure to the little bugs that cause the disease, and you can also treat it with antibiotics because it is a bacterial disease. The modern outlook, epidemic typhus generally occurs in outbreaks when poor sanitary conditions and crowding are present. While once common, it is now rare. Scrub typhus occurs in Southeast Asia, Japan, and northern Australia, and marine typhus occurs in tropical and subtropical areas of the world. But like I said, we have antibiotics now, so it's not necessarily the death sentence that it once was. Cholera has killed an estimated tens of millions of people. It originated in the Bengal region of India near Calcutta with its first recorded outbreak. It started in 1817 and lasted a total of 7 years. Cholera is an infection of the small intestine caused by bacteria. This bacteria originates in shellfish and other seafood. The history of cholera spans really 7 major outbreaks. The latest one occurred in Indonesia beginning in 1961, but spread far beyond its borders into the rest of the world. There have been quite a few recent outbreaks since the 1990s all the way to the present. Symptoms include watery diarrhea, vomiting, and muscle cramps, which tend to lead to dehydration, which in turn lead to death. The disease is typically spread through unsafe drinking water. Therefore, people most at risk are those who live in places with poor sanitation. And of course, the disease originated from shellfish. So if you don't cook your shellfish properly, I guess there is a relatively small chance that you could contract cholera. For treatment, now there are multiple vaccines to stop from contracting the major bacteria that causes cholera, but the best way to stay safe from getting it are to always boil and treat your water with iodine and dispose of your waste hygienically. The modern outlook for cholera is that luckily today its spread is a lot more limited than it was in the past, and in general, science is advanced, knowledge is spread, and the disease is a lot more containable than it has been in the past. Right, so now we're going to make a jump from diseases that have killed tens of millions to diseases that have killed, 100 million and up. So what I'm going to talk about now is influenza or the flu. I mean, most people listening to this video have probably had the flu, and you probably know that, a whole lot of people are constantly dying from the flu, and you might be surprised that it isn't at the very top of this list. And that's because just going through roughly the estimates of just how many people died throughout history, the flu I put around over 100 million at least, but there are some other diseases that have killed 200 million, even more than that, and I'll get to those later. So let's just get into the flu right now. There are over 3 million cases per year in the US alone, which lead to hundreds of thousands of deaths per year worldwide. There have been an estimated over 100 million people that have died from the flu. The origin of the flu are first described in ancient Greece 2,400 years ago, so it's been around for a long time. It's not exactly clear where the flu comes from, but strains of it have been found in pigs, like swine flu, and certain types of birds, like bird flu. The Spanish flu in 1918, in the wake of World War I, killed as many as 50 million people, some say even 100 million, and an estimated 1/3 of the world's population became infected with it. Asian flu in 1957 killed 2 million, and the Hong Kong flu in 1968 killed around 1 million. The most common symptoms for the flu include high fever, runny nose, sore throat, muscle and joint pain, headache, coughing, and feeling tired. These symptoms typically begin 2 days after exposure to the virus and at most last less than a week. Every year, the flu spreads during flu season. The virus spreads through the air through coughs and sneezes, and it's a different strain every year because the flu virus is constantly mutating. The treatment for the flu, there really isn't a treatment other than treating the symptoms. However, as you likely know, there are flu shots, which in theory prevents the flu from spreading and from being contracted. This has varying degrees of success from year to year, depending on just how closely they can nail the strain of the flu that is going to be spreading. So the modern outlook is roughly 3 times per century a pandemic occurs, which infects a large proportion of the world's population and can kill tens of millions of people. One study estimated that if a strain with a similar virulence to the 1918 influenza emerged today, it could kill between 50 and 80 million people. Wow, that's scary to think about. Why the flu is so dangerous is not from how easily it's transferred. The basic reproduction number of influenza is generally around 1.4, meaning that every person who gets infected will spread the disease to an average of 1.4 people. The danger comes from how quickly it spreads. For instance, it takes 2 days for someone to be infected and then to infect another person. This short generation time means that influenza epidemics generally peak at around 2 months and burn out after 3 months. The decision to intervene in an influenza epidemic therefore has to be taken early, and the decision is therefore often made on the back of incomplete data. Another problem is that individuals become infectious before they become symptomatic, which means that putting people in quarantine after they become ill is not as effective as it could be. And that's because people don't know they're sick yet. They have the flu, but they're running around touching stuff and getting everyone else sick. So that's the modern outlook for the flu. It's not exactly great. Now we're going to get into our final disease for this video, and that is tuberculosis. Now, how many people have died from it? Well, during the 20th century alone, tuberculosis killed approximately 100 million people. Tuberculosis is caused by a bacterium called Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Researchers theorize that humans first acquired it in Africa about 5,000 years ago. There is evidence that the first tuberculosis infection happened about 9,000 years ago. In the 19th century, tuberculosis killed an estimated 1/4 of the adult population in Europe. By 1918, 1 in 6 deaths in France were caused by tuberculosis. The bacteria usually attacks the lungs, but tuberculosis bacteria can attack any part of the body, such as the kidney, spine, and brain. Not everyone infected with the tuberculosis bacteria becomes sick. As a result, 2 TB-related conditions exist: latent TB infection and tuberculosis disease. Tuberculosis disease is in the lungs may cause symptoms such as a bad cough that lasts 3 weeks or longer, pain in the chest, coughing up blood, and other symptoms can be weakness or fatigue, weight loss, no appetite, chills, fever, and sweating at night. Symptoms of tuberculosis in other parts of the body depend on the area affected. People who have latent TB infection do not feel sick and do not have any symptoms. Tuberculosis bacteria are spread through the air from one person to another. They are put in the air when a person with TB of the lungs coughs or speaks or even sings. People nearby may breathe in these bacteria and become infection. The CDC states that tuberculosis is not spread by shaking someone's hand, sharing food or drink, touching bed linens, sharing toothbrushes, even kissing, which I find a little bit surprising. But good to know, people with the latent version of tuberculosis cannot spread the disease. Treatment is very important, that people who have TB are treated, finish the medicine, and take the drugs exactly as prescribed. If they stop taking the drugs too soon, they can become sick again. If they do not take the drugs correctly, the TB bacteria that are still alive may become resistant to those drugs, creating a stronger strain of TB that is harder and more expensive to treat. TB can be treated by taking several drugs for 6 to 9 months. There are 10 drugs currently approved by the US FDA for treating TB. Well, there's just a list of drugs. I'm not going to name them. I don't think people really care about that. The modern outlook for tuberculosis is 1/3 of the world's current population has been infected with Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and new infections occur at a rate of 1 per second. About 5 to 10% of these latent infections will eventually progress to active disease, which, if left untreated, kills more than half of its victims. Annually, 8 million people become ill with tuberculosis, and 2 million people die from the disease worldwide. Tuberculosis is still one of the most important health problems in the developing world. Well, so all this kind of really puts stuff in perspective, that there are diseases that have killed just really unthinkable numbers of people. And for a lot of them, you think it's something of the past, like the Black Plague, which I'll talk about in part 3. I mean, it's still around to this day, but it's never going to get to the rate of infection that it was unless, I don't know, we go into another dark ages. But just to think that tuberculosis and the flu are still spreading at such a high rate and people are constantly dying from it all the time, it really puts things in perspective. I mean, people are so worried about the coronavirus, about Ebola, SARS, but if you look at it, those diseases have probably killed like 12,000 people altogether, whereas tuberculosis probably killed 12,000 people, I don't know, in like the last 6 months. No, not even. Probably like the last 6 weeks, at least. So it's just crazy to think about. Here's a quick story. I know I have a relative who works at the CDC. He's kind of a distant relative, so I've only ever met up with him twice, but I actually managed to luckily meet up with him pretty recently. And I asked him, I said, when the coronavirus came out, when you first heard about it, what was the reaction at the CDC? And he kind of just said, hey, it was just another day at the office. And I thought that was really crazy until I started making this video and really thinking about, well, holy shit, it is kind of a small thing when there's all these people dying. And again, these diseases, I'm not even in the top 4 that have killed the most amount of people. So it's just a really crazy thing to imagine the amount of death that's going on to disease and how little it's really talked about in general. Alright, rant over. So if you enjoyed this video, please check out part 1 and stay tuned for part 3. Please like and subscribe because that helps the channel and lets me know that people actually want to hear this stuff. Okay then, thank you for watching. Bye bye. See you next time.